Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast. This is another takeover from Pete Cockwill in his wonderful story. In this episode, he talks about king salmon, grayling, fishing in Cornwall, and a whole lot more. As ever, there's plenty of fun stories, and it ends on a poignant note too. I hope you enjoy this one as much as me.
Well, here goes with another story of the fish people in places. And I did mention in the last one that we would talk a little more about grayling, and we will. And it will probably go on with several things about grayling, because you know I've got a bit of a problem, and the bug has really got me. And I decided I really wanted to try and catch a trophy Arctic grayling. And my continuing research seemed to stick with Great Bear Lake as being the best option. I was already running Alaska trips, and it was pretty easy to add in a week to Great Bear. And lots of friends came to this fabulous place, and we sure had some experiences. There was once a huge storm that kept all the guests stuck at the lodge for 2 days. And all sorts of things happened over the years. I once arranged a competition with Trout Fisherman magazine, and the top prize, funded by Fulling Mill, probably you know, the top UK fly company, was a trip to the Bear along with photographer Pete Cockwill, and we subsequently featured it in the magazine. My great friend Lou from Fort Collins in Colorado came on many of the trips, and he really tolerated my passion for the grayling hunt. We caught fabulous fish, there's no doubt about that, and up to 2 pound 14 ounces, and yet the guys who went spinning to catch fish for their shore lunch would get 4-pounders with monotonous regularity. That was until we went to look at a couple which had been killed from mounting. 4 pounds they most certainly were not. I was really interested in the saga and stories of big grayling, so on one trip when we were overnighting in Winnipeg, I wanted to go and visit the famous Hawkins Taxidermy to see what they might know. That's when things sort of went wrong, because taxi driver couldn't understand my accent. It seemed better to just give up on the idea, and so we asked to be taken to a shopping mall. Now he wanted to know which mall. Cue further confusion, as we had no idea, and just settled on the biggest. So eventually we all set off for downtown Winnipeg, when his cab radio comes on and the controller says, "Hawkins Taxidermy is on Notre Dame Road." Silence from our driver. So I repeated what had just come over the radio, and he says, "How you know that?" The farcical drive wasn't over, because now we were approaching lights in the town centre, and it suddenly became clear that he wasn't going to stop. Smack! And he runs into the back of another car, turns to us and says, "That not my fault." Time for 3 Brits to get out of the cab as fast as we can and leg it to Hawkins Taxidermy. They had some fabulous mounts of all possible animals, birds and fish, but not much concrete proof of big grayling. But it was great to see the place. And needless to say, we looked for a different taxi to get back to our hotel. Grayling run deep in my fishy life, and it all started when I was living at home in Cornwall and caught a few on the Tamar when fishing for trout. They were usually bigger than any of the trout we ever caught, but that's not to say they were also impressive. Size is relative. A grayling of 1 pound would beat most of the trout. Indeed, I never had a brown of 1 pound, although I did get a few peel. That's the West Country expression for sea trout. My first peel came off the Lou, which is a Torridge tributary at Hatherley, where some of my dad's family lived. Although not really an angler, my dad was a gillie on the river in the days when the Torridge was famous for its salmon. He certainly started me off by taking me to fish the canal when I was only 5. But although a huge support, he never showed any inclination to want to fish, although he really loved his tank of tropical fish. The biggest regret of my life is that when he died, I was in Chicago with my young family on their first holiday abroad. He was terminally ill with throat cancer, and before we left, saying goodbye was pretty damn tough. It was only in latter years that I really appreciated his devotion to his family and how little time he ever had for himself. A gifted carpenter, I think he would have been really pleased that I continued to use his tools to make things, even if I always reckon I'm best suited to a chainsaw and 6-inch nails. But back to grayling. When I was still home in Cornwall in the winter months, I specifically went for them, and most enjoyed a float outfit to go trotting. Gilt-tail worm was a favourite bait, much better than brandlings, though the pink marsh worm's pretty damn good. The grayling were never numerous, and 2 or 3 would be a great day. The fish which really did the trick was an absolute beauty of 1.7 pound, which was from a long run just down from the bridge at North Tamerton. It would be many, many more years before I had my first 2-pounder. I know it's hard to believe, but back then in the early 60s, it was salmon which were the biggest problem to our winter grayling days. So very often we would look into a favourite pool, only to see it packed with salmon, and they were only too willing to pick up a little trotted worm. There would usually be a few minutes of pandemonium, followed by a broken leader. Honestly, there were loads of salmon, but in only a few years they were gone. My lifelong friend is Chris Leach, and lucky devil, he still lives in Bude. We both worked for the Cornwall River Authority. This is pre-Environment Agency days. But me for a few years before Chris, as he went to London to get a degree, while I started work straight from grammar school. My job in fisheries and pollution was fascinating, and I really loved it, although chemistry was really never me. I moved on to live in Surrey, where I was based on a new sewage treatment works as a commissioning chemist, but still used to get home regularly. Chris and I often talked of the days when we cycled from Bude to fish the upper parts of the Tamar, when the river seemed to be full of browns along with loads of salmon power. There were days when we would often get 3 fish at a time using a 3-fly cast. But later on, when Chris was working, he told me that on fishery surveys, they struggled to find any trout in the reaches where we used to find large numbers. It really was a rapid decline in a river once full of life, and it's taken many, many years for stocks to recover, although the salmon have never come back to the days when they seemed to be everywhere. Maybe we did have the best of days. My diaries support the catches, but it's tough to reconcile that those were the days when the size limit for trout was a mere 7 inches, and it was perfectly normal to kill everything that made the limit. Nowadays it seems awful to speak of bags of trout averaging 5 ounces, but that's the way it was. It took a long time for catch and release to be the accepted norm for wild fish. Although those rivers remain, with fish of 12 ounces to a pound being the exception, the numbers really have recovered, and although some environments just don't produce much else, there's always the occasional beastie that fools us all. If you ever go to the West Country, then one of the most lovely trout waters is Burrator Reservoir, but it's not by no means a rich water. And yet, when I was working for the River Board and the offices over in Lanson, sorry, most people call it Launceston, but its proper name is Lanson, back in the late 60s, there was a brown trout brought into the fisheries offices from Burrator, and it weighed, wait for it, 11 pound 2 ounces. You never ever know. One of these days I must go back and try the River Strat just out of Bude and see if I can get a trout from those pools I knew so well. Although a recent quick look with Chris showed that they were very badly overgrown and only worming would be practical. Bude still had a railway when I started trout fishing, and because my dad was good friends with the guard, he would arrange for me to ride the train to Bridge Rule before it went on to Oakhampton. Claudie Daniels would then stop the train just outside the station where the track crossed the river. Providing I knew the timetable and was back on the bridge, I would get a ride back into town, and all for the privilege of being able to give a few of the Tamar's trout to Claudie in thanks. Those were the days. It does seem hard to believe now, but when I was at grammar school, the head was Mr. Worrell, and he took to fly fishing. Such of an evening, he would come with a couple of us to Lower Tamar and learn his sport. We kept in touch, and some years later arranged to meet at Avington and introduce him and his son to some of Hampshire's trout, which far exceeded anything we ever caught in Cornwall. Christmas cards with a few lines about our fishing exploits continued for many, many years until he passed away. There's no doubt fishing is the greatest leveller. You can be mega wealthy, captain of industry, or privileged by birth, but fish can still outwit you. and learning to successfully wield a fly rod can open up so many opportunities. Certainly been great for me, but being Cornish and having had a wonderful upbringing, it remains as my core, and it's so good to go home occasionally. Chris and I remain firm friends, and he's been on some of the trips I arranged to far off places. Great Bear was one, and we shared some epic grayling catches. But the trip I will remember the most was shortly after Chris had had a heart scare and we were off to Alaska. It's become custom for me to arrange a bit extra for people on these trips by hiring a car and driving down to either Seward or the Kenai for a day or two. Chris came along when I had arranged a guide boat on the Kenai to fish for kings. Up at the crack of dawn, well actually up earlier because it's never really dark in July, and down to the boat ramps to be out on the river well before 6. Guide boats can only start fishing at 6 a.m, so we were all ready with the lures rigged and ready to be dropped into that 12-knot mass of swirling glacial-coloured water. It used to be a bit of a zoo with guide and private boats all jockeying for position back when Kenai kings were really numerous, and in the days when it took a 70-pounder to even be noticed. Anyway, 6 o'clock came, and "Okay, everybody, drop the lures," shouted the guide. And literally, seconds later, Chris says, "I've got one." "Don't be so daft," I said. But oh no, he did have a king, before his lure had even hit the bottom. So there was Chris, supposedly taking it easy after his health scare, and now battling an angry 50-pound king salmon. I can't remember what else we had that morning, because nothing could quite eclipse that catch. Sort of what you might call a baptism of fire for Chris in Alaska. King salmon are a truly mighty fish, and on fly gear will sort out most people until you get the hang of becoming the boss and taking control as best as you can. Many times I've had to get into the boat to follow kings downriver when on my usual July trip to the Connectoc. Once they get below you in the current, it's unlikely you will get them back up, and sometimes it can be a long chase. We usually fish in pairs with the guide, and when one angler is hooked up and has to go off in the boat chase, the other is left fishing in the pool. Woe betide you if you hook a king while the boat is gone. It's actually a relief when you hear the engine coming back upriver, and one look will tell you if the chase was a success. If the angler sat facing the wind, he landed the fish. Sat hunched with his back to the wind, and the battle went the fish's way. I've been lucky with a few beasties and lost just as many. One chase downriver was with Jim Teeney doing pictures when I was into a 40-plus chromer. Everything was going well, right to the stage of getting the fish into the gravel shallows, when somehow I got the leader and fly line junction stuck in the tip ring, just as a fish made one last run to deeper water. Ping went the leader. That's when I would have liked my good friend to offer some sympathy, but all he said was operator error. Correct, but not exactly what I wanted to hear. Sometimes when staying out with Jim in Oregon, we would drive down to the coast and fish the Trask. It's not a big river, but does have massive kings, and the one-time world fly record of 63 pounds came from here. The pools are pretty small by Salmon River standards, and one I remember had a pile of rocks at the lower end where you could watch the water leaving the pool. Sometimes the water would visibly rise as a pod of big fish came into the pool, and shortly after would come a take or two. One day I had a pretty good hookup, and the fish instantly left the pool, with Jim shouting to me, "Break! Break!" He didn't mean the real breaks, he meant break the leader, as the fish I had hooked was unstoppable and heading back to the ocean a couple of miles downriver. That's a bit scary. My moment of destiny with kings came on the Connectoc in a pool we knew as the 10-minute. It was in 1995, and in those years there were lots of kings in the river. We had seen a truly huge fish moving around the pool. The Connectoc is invariably dead clear, and in good light it was easy to see the fish. I was fishing with a great guy called Don Staziker, who went on to become a truly excellent UK guide and a great writer for trout and salmon. We fished hard for the kings and the big fella, but to no response, and we tried all sorts of flies. That's until I put on a pattern my daughter had made for me, which comprised blue and pink marabou with purple tinsel. It subsequently got called the Fonzie fly after her name, Fiona. Casting that fly across where the fish was lying, I saw it lift up a bit and snap at something. I guessed it had to be my fly and lifted. That was the start of a rather long battle. Luckily for me, it never left the 200-yard pool and eventually came into the edge of the river. I don't think it was anything to do with me, but there it was, and I could clearly see the fly in the corner of the mouth. I said to Eli, my guide, I'm going to nip below it and pull hard towards the bank to unbalance it, and you've got one chance to grab the tail. Get it wrong and you die. Then, all of a sudden, he was sliding the fish onto the stones, and it was pictures, handshakes, etc., etc. Utterly impossible for me to hold the fish on my own, so there we were with the giant, and quickly got it safely back in. Don was fantastic with the camera. The guide crew found that same fish a few weeks later after spawning time, and confirmed its length at 51 inches, with the girth of 34 inches. So you can work it out for yourself as to its rough weight, using the formula of length times girth squared divided by 800. So, near-death incident number 2 with my great friend Lou. This time, it was Great Bear Lake. And we were out with our guide Craig and having a lovely day, way south of the lodge past Caribou Point, when the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse. Pretty quickly became clear we needed to make a run for the lodge, and things were changing by the minute. Great Bear is huge, and storms here can be horrendous. Craig's a great boatman, but it was obvious he was having trouble making any way in the huge waves. Going over is certain death, as the water is only just above freezing. As we were approaching Caribou Point, Craig shouted that turning to make the run back was asking for trouble, so we headed to a small gravel and rock island and beached the boat. There was no shelter, as this little island was only a few feet above water level, so we hungered down to wait it out. After what seemed to be forever, there was a bit of a change in the wind direction, and the wave formation made it look like it would be possible to start the run back to the lodge. That should be about 30 minutes, but it took us 2 hours in those mountainous waves. 2 very relieved anglers got to their cabin and poured 2 glasses of quality scotch, and then stood there hugging each other. I don't ever want to go through a boat experience like that again. Seems daft for somebody who travels a lot, but I'm ashamed to say that I can't swim, and I grew up on the North Cornish coast. Truth is that I had 2 scary incidents as a teenager. One in the marvellous sea pool at Bude, when the sea was breaking over the wall and my weak swimming efforts meant I couldn't beat the waves. Going under, my feet touched sand in one corner, and it was enough to make me get onto the edge and recover. The second time was in the surf while just goofing about, but I got knocked down by a wave and then turned over in the water, such that I was really scared. That was enough, and I've never been able to overcome my fear of water and go for proper lessons. Thinking back on my near 40 years of going on trips, and taking what now amounts to several hundred guests on their adventures, it certainly does seem there have been a few incidents, but actually the amazing times outweigh the occasional blip. Being with someone on what is likely to be their once-in-a-lifetime trip is a very special time, and to share with them a first or a personal best is far more than I could have hoped for when I first got into running trips. On the Alaska trips, it's usually a king salmon that makes the moment for many, and it's absolutely great to be right there for the final moment when the fish is finally into the shallows and it's time for pictures. Holding a big fish isn't easy, and we often get the guide to hold it with the angler alongside, and that way the fish looks great and the angler is all smiles, providing, of course, he takes his hat and glasses off. Get a great picture! My good friend Gary Patterson had his best event on the Connectoc with a superb rainbow, which he had spotted such that he could cast directly to it. Gary had caught some memorable kings, but that rainbow was very special. Interesting things also happen on some of these trips to far-off places. A group of us were in Santiago once in South America on the way to fish sea-run browns on Tierra del Fuego, and I'd be warned by the hotel to not wear watches or any form of jewellery as it would be targeted. Sure enough, we were looking at the inside of the magnificent cathedral when the doors burst open and a lad ran through the church chased by police. He'd stolen a handbag and he easily outsmarted the police. Another time we were again going through Santiago on the way to Lago Yocho to fish for trout. I very rashly tried calamari and ostrich. Very nice it was too. But maybe there was something in it that didn't agree with me, because next day, when on the drive to the lodge, I had a stomach rumble and one of those instantaneous warnings that ablution facilities are needed now. Stopping the truck, I somehow vaulted a 5-bar gate and got behind a hedge. My goodness, that was close. And bye-bye to another pair of socks. Actually, Lago Yocho was really interesting, and certainly a place I would like to hear how it fishes now. The lake has wonderful trout, which actively feed on adult dragonfly along the reed beds, but maybe now it's even better, because back then, must be 20 odd years ago, the river running out of the lake was just starting to receive runs of king salmon. We saw them rolling as they came into the lake, and these huge fish always die after spawning. So their great bodies enrich the environment such that it brings a growth spurt to the indigenous fish. Actually, there was only ever a sort of minnow in any of these Chilean waters until trout were introduced. And then when sea cages had their inevitable escapes, that's when salmon species began to exploit a new niche. South America is now the place to go if you want a truly big king salmon, and it will surely hold the next world record. That's currently held by a 97-pounder off Alaska's Kenai, caught back in the late 80s. It was on this Yocho trip that our hosts asked if we would like a lamb barbecue the next evening. That sounded great. Except that the next morning, as we got ready to fish, we could hear this pathetic bleating getting ever closer. And towards the lodge came a guy pushing a wheelbarrow with a trussed-up sheep in it. I'm not in the slightest bit squeamish, but somehow I went off the barbecue idea. Another trip through Santiago was a real laugh, as we had a bit of time to look around, but the 4 of us got hungry and went to a strange little restaurant for a meal. None of us spoke Spanish and couldn't work out the menu at all. One of my truly great friends was on this trip. Charlie Frost was 1 day older than me, and a fantastic guy who very sadly succumbed to vascular dementia and passed away in 23. He came on loads of trips and excelled himself on this one, as he reckoned he would ask for 4 meals like the one being eaten on an adjacent table. It was highly entertaining to watch his arms waving around and repeatedly holding up 4 fingers. Quite a while later, there were 4 small plates brought to the table, then 1 slightly larger plate with 4 small pieces of a strange-looking meat. That's when we decided it wasn't safe to let Charlie order food. Charlie had a fantastic farm at Newdigate in Surrey, where he diversified into so many things: Christmas trees, lettings, small business properties, and carp legs. I had great trips there to Centre Lake, and he was so insistent on it being cared for. Woe betide any angler leaving rubbish. We fished together in so many places around the world, and I do miss him terribly. I would reckon probably the closest I ever got to having a brother. Dementia is an awful affliction, and such a terrible way for a man to go who was a true powerhouse of a character. Charlie was great friends to so many people, and one I regularly see is Jerry Strebanowski. He runs Tillingbourne Trout near Guildford in Surrey. It's the place to go when you want a fish smoked. I often do the 50-mile run there with the back of the car full of frozen trout to get processed for the fishery where we live now. We have many a laugh about the odd things we get involved with, and so often revolves around dead creatures. I personally don't have a problem with anything like that, and so many of my jobs have involved getting unbelievably wet and dirty. Things like sewers, cesspools, ditches and general muck just never bothered me much. Before the shop days, I worked in local government as a chemist on a sewage treatment works, and where we had a large depot doing all the things which local councils did before cutbacks hit them. Nothing fazed me, and I could handle any of the equipment and do any of the jobs involving sewage and drains. Indeed, my view was that if I had to organise the guys and ask them to do anything, then I should also be able to do any of those jobs. That's largely why there's nothing that really bothers me. Same with the occasional need for, shall we say, controlling pests. And of course, I spent 34 years of my life on a big shooting estate in Surrey, often working along with the gamekeeper. Helping out with fox control was part of the job, and at times the fishery had occasional issues as well. Mink came through the system, and inevitably the Black Death, cormorants, were a continual problem. There were lots of roe deer on the estate, and I really like venison, so it was no problem to take an animal every so often. The odd thing is that when I was about 60, I went out to get one, and that wasn't a problem, as I knew exactly where to find them. I also had a .243 firearms licence, etc., so it was all legit. That is, until on this occasion I had the animal in the scope and couldn't pull the trigger. I've got no problem at all with anyone else taking a deer alongside me. It's just that I didn't want to do the deed anymore. Bit weird, isn't it? And yet I know that it's not at all uncommon among shooting people, with many pheasant shots now preferring to work their dogs rather than participate in the shoot itself. Maybe it's an age thing.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly published magazine owned and run by fly anglers. When it comes to fly fishing, we've got you covered.